Dr. Musil, and welcome to Lecture 6 on hedonism, where we'll discuss the philosophical view of hedonism as articulated through the philosophy of Epicurus primarily. And as we'll see, he really sets the stage then and is very influential on subsequent philosophers, moral philosophers in particular, especially as we'll see in our next lecture, in the first lecture of the second part of the course on Jeremy Bentham, where we get our first taste of utilitarianism, a major ethical theory. Again, Epicurus and these foundational thoughts that he expresses way back in 341 to 270 BC, right, way back in the ancient Greek era. These are going to be very, very, again, influential on many figures down the road. Again, especially as we'll see Jeremy Bentham. So at this point in the course, right, we're sort of transitioning or turning our focus away from that issue we've been wrestling with the last three lectures. How to go about sort of giving up some of our freedoms for a greater sense of security. Setting that sort of issue aside, now we're going to transition and shift to a focus in the second part of the course where we'll look at utilitarianism and deontology, arguably the two most famous and popular moral theories that exist. I will be referencing what I call the big three oftentimes throughout the remainder of the course. And what I mean by that is if you were to poll, people that subscribe to moral theories, people that are familiar with all these various moral theories that we will survey throughout the remainder of the course, and if you were to ask them, which do you most closely identify with, especially if we're talking about, professional philosophers, right, moral philosophers that teach at universities and so on, 95% of them, I would argue, are going to subscribe to one of the big three. And those big three are utilitarianism, which we're going to turn our attention to in Lecture 7, right, with Bentham. Deontology, when we've talked about Immanuel Kant, he's kind of the champion or MVP of deontology. And then virtue ethics. Aristotle is the one most closely oftentimes associated with virtue ethics. But those are the big three. And again, what I mean is they're the most popular by far, I would say, of all the prominent moral theories. And so in the second part of the course, we're going to turn our focus to utilitarianism, deontology. And it'll become clear why we focused on them together, because they basically say polar opposites. It'll become even more clear as we discuss them. And so before, though, we turn our focus first to utilitarianism, then to deontology, I think it would behoove us to mention a little bit about Epicurus, because he is, again, so influential in the thought of the utilitarians that follow him, thousands of years later, like Bentham and Mill. And so that's, again, the impetus for us spending a little bit of time here in Lecture 6 discussing the very basics of this theory known as hedonism, which, again, Epicurus is closely associated with oftentimes. And so we'll talk a little bit about Epicurus, but we'll develop this idea of hedonism then in much more detail in that next lecture, in the seventh lecture, when we talk about Bentham. We'll develop the idea of hedonism even more. So here we're just going to kind of get a taste of it, talk about this dude named Epicurus, some of his interesting thoughts on God, death, and I'll draw some parallels and some similarities to Socrates, another probably way more famous Greek philosopher who we've already mentioned in the course. Right? They have very similar views and say very similar things with regard to some of these issues. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about his recipe for the good life, or living ultimately a pleasurable life. I mean, let's get it out of the way, right? What's hedonism? It's basically the theory that puts the pursuit of pleasure above all else. Okay? And we probably had a general idea of that coming into the course, right? It's one of those words we had kind of a vague maybe connotation or sense of what the term meant. But as we'll see, oftentimes our colloquial or typical sense of what hedonism isn't indicative of what someone like Epicurus actually thought, right? It's not this extravagant indulgence in all things that are pleasurable. No, it's a much more calculative, rational process where sometimes you'll have to turn down, right, small pleasures in the moment to get much greater pleasures down the road. And so, again, it's one of those ideas that we probably had a general sense, right? It has something to do with pleasure, but I think, again, it would be very helpful to discuss what Epicurus says, because these thinkers who have advanced hedonism throughout the centuries, and Bentham included, they don't mean this extravagant indulgence in pleasure, right? No, they mean, again, a much more calculative, measured approach. And so, again, we'll see how that's the case as we proceed here, not only in Epicurus, but then as we turn our attention to the second part of the course and Jeremy Bentham, also in Jeremy Bentham. Okay, so who is this dude Epicurus? Again, he was 341 to 270 BC, so another famous, as if we don't have enough of these famous Greek philosophers, another famous Greek philosopher. We mentioned Parmenides, Heraclitus, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. I know I threw all those guys out in the intro lecture, right, lecture 1. Well, Epicurus is another famous Greek philosopher. These guys, they had huge contributions in philosophy. And the other thing that really stands out about a lot of these guys, there's a reason why they're so well known, right? A lot of times people make contributions, and then a few hundred years later, right, somebody else will come along and improve things, right? And slowly over time, that original person won't really be relevant or spoken of as much. But with these ancient Greek philosophers, what really stands out in my mind is how long-lasting these contributions are. Right? You still hear about them just as much today, it seems like, as you did hundreds or thousands of years ago. So not only do they make these significant contributions, but they're very long-lasting too. Anyway, so moving on, very influential figure. And we will see that firsthand, as I've already intimated several times, when we talk about Bentham, and we'll see all the similarities when we talk about Bentham. He's similar to Aristotle, and I guess this is true, right? It makes sense of the older philosophers that you're going to lose a lot of their works, right? But Epicurus, wrote a lot, but we don't have a lot of his works remaining, and that was true of I mentioned Aristotle. Although with Aristotle, we have still a whole shelf out in my library is full of Aristotle's works, but supposedly that we only have 20% of his actual works that still have survived to this day. So true of a lot of these older, philosophers, we lose their works over time. Seems to be the case with Epicurus. Mentioned his influence. So we'll move on to slide or page 3 here. There's a good reason why Epicurus is known as a hedonist, right? He makes no qualms about it. He comes around and says, right, pleasure is the aim of all we do. And we're going to see, again, that's a recurring theme with the utilitarians, especially, Bentham and Mill. He does come out and say, and it's not always put in terms of pleasure, right, but also in terms of happiness. So, all we do is for the sake of happiness, Epicurus says, and then so too will Bentham and Mill in subsequent lectures we'll see. Everything we do is for the sake of happiness. But what do they mean by happiness? Well, they just mean pleasure, right? Pleasure or the flip side of that coin, right? The absence of pain. So good reason why he's known as, one of the primary or most well-known hedonists, because he basically says everything, again, we do is for the sake of pleasure. Now, again, as I've mentioned earlier, right, he immediately cautions us, right, to proceed philosophically through reflection and a measured approach, not to just endure endless bouts of drinking, as he says, right? No, that's not what I mean, right, by seeking pleasure. I mean it in a more calculative, rational, philosophical way. But more on that later. Again, a quote from page 43 of our textbook that's, again, indicative of just, why we should associate Epicurus with hedonism. He suggests that, quote, we must exercise ourselves in the things which bring happiness. And again, what he means by happiness is pleasure and the absence of pain. Since if that be present, we have everything. And if that be absent, all our actions are directed toward attaining it. Okay? So we don't look any further if we feel happy, right? And if we don't feel happy, then everything we do is motivated to try to feel happy. It's basically the gist of that. Okay, and I already mentioned, right? I mentioned on page or slide 3, right? The third, or this bullet point here. Again, that's me emphasizing, because you can't emphasize it enough, that it's about pleasure, right? But it's not just dive into everything that seems pleasurable. No, you need to take it in a cautious, calculative way or manner. You need to proceed in a calculative manner. Okay? And I point out the last bullet point on that slide. Nonetheless, right, Epicureanism is still associated with that sort of unbridled indulgence in whatever pleasures, are in front of us, right? So that's a mistake. Okay, I think that anybody that's at all familiar with Epicurus will immediately recognize that is obviously a mistake to associate his philosophy with that. Again, that constant sort of indulgence in pleasure. No, that's not what he means. He doesn't mean going out and drinking every night, going out and blowing all your money. No, you have to proceed in a very cautious, calculative, being a philosopher, right, rational manner. All right, let's turn to page or slide 4 and talk a little bit. We had a very short, right? We didn't have a very long excerpt from Epicurus, but I still think what we have there, you can kind of get a good sense of what his thoughts were regarding some of these issues, right? Like God and death. He obviously doesn't fear really either one of them, which was not the case for people during his time, right? They feared both quite a bit, the gods and death. But he thought most people, for those reasons, right, because they had that constant sense of fear, they were misguided. Okay? And he talks a lot about that in our excerpt as well. So he has some interesting observations regarding God. As I mentioned, he's a little bit different, right? He's definitely doesn't fit with the norm of the time with respect to his beliefs regarding either. And he thinks that most people are misguided during his life, right? In the sense, particularly in the sense that they have this fear, this unwarranted fear of both God and death. For him, rather, God, right? It's almost like if anything, it's almost like a reflective tool. God is sort of the ultimate measure of what happiness looks like for him, it seems like. He does seem to suggest that God or gods exist, right? So he's on board with, most of the time would have suggested that. But again, he thinks that everyone else is, or most people at the time, are completely misguided in sort of their views of God, and they're not looking at God in the right way, and they're not using God as, again, kind of a reflective tool to better envision what happiness looks like and how we can get there. So, again, the central tenet in Epicurus' belief is that, quote, God is a living being, immortal and happy. Right? These are the kinds of things he emphasizes. Okay? If we ought to have this notion of God, and again, God, for him, right, one of the chief characteristics is that God is happy. He specifically says that, again, on page 43. He makes it clear that most people's, again, beliefs regarding God are misguided. He says, quote, truly there are gods, okay, and that seems to be, again, him acknowledging, yes, God or gods exist, and knowledge of them is evident, but they are not so much as the multitude believe, end quote. That's page 43. And so, too, on 43, quote, the utterances of the multitude about the gods are not true preconceptions, but false assumptions, end quote. So really, he would say, I would argue, that what his contemporaries got right, all they got right was that God exists, right? But then everything else they kind of screw up, right? They fear God. They think of God in this sort of vindictive sort of meting out justice sense, right? Rather than a God that encapsulates, the happy life, as Epicurus suggested we ought to view God. Okay, so that's his views regarding God. Again, that was slider page 4. Let's move on to what he has to say regarding death. Very similar sorts of ideas here, right? It's not something that we ought to go around fearing constantly. And, why are so many people not as happy as they could be? Because in part they do go, constantly dreading their demise, right? Death. I could not, and I mentioned the similarities on the next slide. I could not help but be reminded, and I'm much more familiar with Socrates and Plato, could not help but be reminded when I read Epicurus of Socrates, because they say so many similar things, especially some of these remarks regarding death. So I guess first it would be who was to point out, as they did in the introduction to the Hedonism that I had you read as like the 2-page intro. He's a materialist, right? So, naturally when we die, he thinks that's it, right? The lights turn off, and that's it. There's nothing else to register. And so it makes sense then, if you take that view, right, that death then wouldn't seem to be something to be feared insofar as you're not existing to feel it, right? He thinks that, again, once we die, everything shuts off, and in order to feel pain, you have to be on, so to speak, alive. And since death means the opposite of that, right, not being alive, then you can't feel pain, right? So if it's not something that can be painful, what are we doing fearing it? He's arguing. That's the gist of the argument, right? So he says things like, and again, all this goes to show that, again, we shouldn't fear death. Or yearn also is one of the prominent themes here is why do we have this lust for immortality, for living forever, right? Instead, we ought to focus on, right, making the life we have as meaningful as possible. So he says things like, quote, believe that death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness, end quote. Again, it's that idea that we turn off, and so how can it be anything to us, right? When we are no longer there to perceive it. But again, if you don't agree with that materialistic view, then maybe death is something to be feared, to fear. Another quote from 44, quote, "Death is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death is not come," right? We haven't died yet. "And when death is come, we are not." Again, the same idea. Okay? There's no pain to be sensed when we're alive because we haven't died yet. And then when we die, there's no pain to be sensed because we're not alive to sense it. And then regarding that sort of, again, ill-founded desire to live forever, he says, quote, "Even as people choose a food not merely and simply the larger portion, but the more pleasant, so the wise seek to enjoy the time which is most pleasant and not merely that which is longest." Let's stop focusing on trying to stay alive for as long as possible, right? And instead, let's focus on how we can make ourselves as happy as possible for the time we have. That's what he thinks we should emphasize. And again, focusing constantly and dreading death, it totally distracts us from what we ought to truly be focusing on. And I think that speaks to, again, his and we'll emphasize this towards the end of the lecture, his constant emphasis on reflection. Being the philosopher he is, right? Being rational and reflecting on these kinds of things. And who knows, if we did reflect on these kinds of things more, maybe we wouldn't fear death like so many of us tend to, or at least as often. So then we will turn, I mentioned these similarities, right? Turn to page or slide 6. Can't help but note, extreme similarities between a lot of what Epicurus says and Socrates. Socrates pretty much advances the same sort of perspective regarding death. He can't understand why so many are in constant fear of it. And what's interesting is he expresses these views for the most part towards the end of his life when, for example, he's on trial in Athens. He is ultimately sentenced to death and executed by his fellow citizens. He says all this stuff when he has literally been sentenced to die and death's staring him in the face. And I've always been astounded by that, right? And yet he, in the face of all that, he professes a very similar view as Epicurus here, right? We shouldn't fear death. He goes on and on about how it doesn't make sense to dread it as if it's this evil, when for all we know, Socrates suggests it could be in fact the greatest good. How do we know that there's not something much greater that awaits us? He said he's a philosopher, so he's all about pursuing the truth. And he says, look, there's two possibilities basically upon death. One, what Epicurus says, right? The materialist point of view. Everything that just turns off, that's it. And he's on board with Epicurus. Why fear death if that's the case, right? We're not alive anymore to sense any pain. What's the problem? Or he offers a second alternative. There's an afterlife, in which case he thinks, or he says, he describes it as, quote, "a migration of the soul from this world to another." And this is from Plato's Apology, a dialogue by Plato, by the way. In which case he talks about that, right? So there's some sort of migration to an afterlife. He talks about this in a glowing way, as if will provide then an opportunity to keep pursuing the truth and to speak to people who passed before and maybe inquire into what they know and so on. So he views that second option, this possibility of an afterlife, as a great thing as well. So from Socrates' vantage point, he's on board with Epicurus. There's no rational reason, no reason to fear death. And yet so many of us constantly do so, right? We dwell on it. Maybe it's not always at the forefront of our consciousness, but for a lot of us, right, it's always in the background. It's always there, right? That constant fear, that constant dread of the end. So Socrates, again, very much on board with Epicurus. In Plato's Apology, he says, quote, "The fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom." The idea is, who are we? What are we suggesting by fearing death? We're suggesting that we know that something bad is going to happen, but how do we know that, right? That's just the pretense of knowing something we don't know, actually. "The fear of death is indeed the pretense of wisdom, and not real wisdom, being the pretense of knowing the unknown. And no one knows whether death, which men in their fear apprehend to be the greatest evil, may not be the greatest good." And so we mentioned, right, the ways in which he thinks, in fact, far from being an evil, death might in fact be a good. Okay, so do note those similarities to Socrates. Let's turn our attention to page or slide 7, and we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly, so we know what matters, right, is happiness. in other words, pleasure and the absence of pain. We know that's what matters to Epicurus. We'll talk a little bit more about how to go about getting that, right? What is the recipe for happiness or pleasure in the absence of pain? And what's the methodology going to be like? And again, this is where the constant reflection, proper due reflection, is going to be espoused by him, right? We have to constantly reflect on what will, in fact, bring us pleasure, the most pleasure, a happy life. So, really, in a nutshell, right, what is happiness? It's an easy equation, right? So it's like basically pain-free mental and physical existence, right? You don't have any of this, for example, constant dread of death, right? You don't have that mental anguish or mental dread afflicting you. And so too, you're free from bodily pains and injuries. Okay? So securing health of body and tranquility of mind, that's a quote from page 44. That's essentially what he calls this is a quote also from 44, the sum and end of a happy life, right? The goal of a happy life, again, is securing health of body and tranquility of mind, peacefulness of mind, and a healthy body. So let's just say peace of mind. Pretty straightforward, simple recipe, and yet so many of us screw that up. And that's where I really like, hopefully you all have had a chance to check out the Alain de Botton, or I don't know how you say his last name, but excellent video. Really like how he captures Epicurus' philosophy. It's really fascinating, some of the things he details as well, like that wall where, I forgot the dude's name, right, but the wealthy guy at the time who writes basically Epicurus' philosophy, reminding all the people in the marketplace and so on of Epicurus' philosophy right there for all to see. Anyway, very, very simple, straightforward recipe, yet so many of us screw it up. And I was mentioning Alain de Botton, or however you say his name, does a good job of explaining or talking about why Epicurus thinks so many of us screw this up, right? Talking about advertising, commercialism, and so on. But underneath it all, right, and this actually speaks to then a big point we want to hammer home. And really, right, if you take a calculated, measured approach and think about these things, ultimately Epicurus is going to suggest, you'll see that what you ought to strive for is not extravagance and indulging in every pleasure you can, but rather the simple life, simplicity. Maintaining a simple life, in fact, is the easiest way to achieve peace of mind and a healthy body. Where we complicate things is when we throw all these, as he would say, unnecessary desires into the mix. Another similarity to Socrates and Plato, who also distinguished between necessary and unnecessary desires, so too does Epicurus. Right? We throw in all these unnecessary desires, needing to have nice watches and jewelry and so on. Okay? We get away from the simple life, and we complicate things, okay? And we create all these issues for ourselves. And soon, right, before you know it, we no longer have this. And oftentimes, right, if we're going out eating fast food all the time, not exercising, et cetera, pretty soon we don't have that either. And of course, these two are interrelated too, right? If you're constantly depressed, that's going to have ramifications on your physical health directly. So here's the basic recipe, and ultimately to get that, as we'll see, right, is the advice is simplify things. So he comes to the conclusion, again, this conclusion, right, that this is the end, right, of the happy life. Given that his premise that, quote, the end of all our actions be free from pain and fear. Okay, fear again, we want to eliminate fear through peace of mind. And then eliminate pain by way of a healthy body. Okay? So in sum, on his account, pleasure and happiness is simply, quote, the absence of pain in the body and trouble in the soul, end quote. And that's from 45, page 45 of the textbook. So going on to slider page 8, that's basically what I was getting at here, right? The simple life. That's our best chance. That offers the best chance, right? If we simplify things, that offers us the best chance of actually right? Achieving peace of mind and a healthy body. So it's far from that extravagant, reckless indulgence of all pleasures possible. No, right? We have to think about things. That's why it doesn't behoove you, right, especially when you're taking classes, to go out and go to the bars every night or get drunk every night, even though that's pleasurable at the time, right? He says again, if we engage in the proper reflection, we'll realize that although those offer small pleasures, we're much better off. We stand to gain a much greater pleasure if we sacrifice some of those smaller pleasures now, right, and maybe stay home and study. A much greater pleasure awaits us in the long run. We get that degree, right? We get that job, and then we can do all kinds of things, right? So a much greater pleasure awaits. And so oftentimes that will require us to, in fact, turn down certain pleasures in the moment. Okay? I highly recommend the Alain de Botton video where he talks about how we get sidetracked, how it's easy for a lot of us to get sidetracked. And I thought it was interesting how he mentioned back even in Epicurus' day, Epicurus points out why do so many of us screw this up? Advertising. And I was thinking about that. That's actually my trigger. I always tell people in face-to-face classes, don't bring up advertising or commercialism, because I will go off. I cannot stand the commercial nature of everything in our society. And so it just blew my mind that was already an issue back in his time. I can't imagine like what he would think of our society, where you can't go anywhere without seeing billboards and advertisements everywhere. Even in our schools, right? There's advertisements everywhere, sending home flyers for fast food joints, which is a whole nother issue. Not only is that advertising, but that's unhealthy, right? So that video I think does a great job of pointing out some of the ways that Epicurus thinks we get sidetracked. Couldn't agree more. This commercialism, this advertising, we all think we're immune from it, right? Oh, it doesn't affect me. I know what they're doing. But yet there's a reason why they pay millions of dollars for the advertising, right? Everybody thinks it doesn't affect them, but in fact it does. And I try not to go on and on about this too much, but if you think about it, advertising can be construed as potentially a very egregious evil. I mean, we know what it does psychologically to people, and we know that how it works on people. It can convince people that have no money to go out and blow their money on things that they don't need, which was exactly what de Botton was pointing out in his video as well. To me, of all the things we try to emphasize and focus on, I just think that we allow this unbridled consumerism and sort of corporate mentality throughout society, and I think a lot of times it goes unchecked. And I just wonder, if that's not one of the greatest evils we just let go. Anyway, that's the most I will go on about that. But I really did appreciate that point. I think that there really is something to that, where we get led astray by oftentimes thinking we need all this stuff by way of advertising that we really don't. And again, it leads us away from the simple life, right? To think we need all these unnecessary things. So he does distinguish, getting back to Epicurus himself, right, between necessary and unnecessary desires, natural and unnatural desires, and then necessary and unnecessary desires. So, and really what we ought to focus on are natural, necessary desires. Right? He talks about, on page 45, he suggests, quote, they have the sweetest enjoyment of luxury. This is going back to this idea of simplified things. They have the sweetest enjoyment of luxury who stand least in need of it, and that whatever is natural is easily procured, and only the vain and worthless hard to win. So I think that's another fascinating point, that not only is this the ticket to success, and somehow we all screw it up, but it's actually super easy too. It's easily procured. The things, the simple life, it's there. Where we get bogged down and where we get depressed is because we think we need all these other things, right? That we don't. When in fact, what we really need is right there, 9 times out of 10, right? In fact, according to the video, right, all we need is friends, reflection, and freedom. Friends, where is it? Right here. Friends, freedom, and adequate reflection, right? The 3 key components of a simple life that will ultimately, right, if you emphasize those things, lead to this. Quote, to habituate oneself, therefore, to simple and inexpensive diet supplies all that is needful for health, end quote. Don't worry about going to fancy restaurants. Keep it simple. An inexpensive diet. That's all you need for a healthy body and peace of mind. Turn to page or slide 9. Going back to the 3 things that are necessary, as de Botton points out in that video, right? Friends, social life. Aristotle also talks a lot about that, how we're social creatures, right? Freedom. Okay, Mill would agree with that, right? We're not going to be happy if we're constantly restricted. Think back to what the kind of points Mill was pointing out. And then, probably most importantly, and why so many people fail, what we need is proper reflection. We need to be philosophical, right? We need to engender a philosophical character, right? Or at least facilitate that to some degree, right? That's going to enable us to figure those kinds of things out, like I mentioned earlier, right? That it's not in our interest to go out drinking each night, even though it seems pleasurable at the time. No, we have a much greater pleasure to gain if we refrain from doing those small pleasurable things now. We have a much greater pleasure down the road. Well, it's our rational capacity, it's our ability to reason and reflect that allows us to figure that out. Okay? And so when he mentions prudence and thinking things, that's what he means, thinking these things through, reflecting on these things, being philosophical about life. And that's what he's emphasizing, at the very beginning of the excerpt. When he talks about, especially I think this is literally the very, very beginning, when he talks about it doesn't matter what stage of life you're in, right? Proper rational reflection, philosophical reflection is necessary for happiness, leading a good life, a pleasurable life. So there's no stage in life that it's not needed, right? That proper philosophical reflection. That is, quote, both old and young ought to seek wisdom. And that was on page 43. So to prudence is thought to be, quote, a more precious thing even than the other virtues. He says that on 45. And prudence, what does that look like? It entails, quote, sober reasoning, searching out the grounds of every choice and avoidance, and banishing those beliefs through which the greatest disturbances take possession of the soul. And it's figuring out how we can get this and this. And it's how Epicurus figured it out. Again, being philosophical, realizing that we need to simplify things, keeping it simple. And if we properly reflect, in a daily sort of way, we will make sure we stick to this. Lose that proper reflection, and over time, we're going to be led astray again. That's why at all points in our life, right, he thinks it's equally important. Okay, that's really all we want to say about hedonism at this point. We talked about Epicurus. There's a reason why, obviously, he's one of the first people that philosophers will mention when hedonism is brought up. We talked about what hedonism is, what Epicurus associates with pleasure and happiness, or in other words, our best sort of approach or methodology to take in terms of getting this, right? And so I mentioned we're just laying the very basics, the groundwork for this idea of hedonism. We'll pick up in the next lecture, the first lecture of the next part or section of the course. We'll pick up and discuss in much more detail this idea of hedonism through our discussions with Bentham. And so we'll see with Bentham, a utilitarian, he's going to build his utilitarian moral theory upon these basic building blocks that Epicurus, offered thousands of years before. So at any rate, that's it. That's lecture 6. So that's the last lecture, part 1 or section 1. So at this point, we've covered everything 1 through 6. So everything that's covered on the first part of the first part quiz. Real quick review, I guess, would be appropriate here, since you'll probably be taking the quiz soon after seeing this. The format of the quiz. Remember, there's 20 multiple choice questions. They're each worth 5 points. Okay, so 20 times 5, that's 100 points on the quiz is going to be associated with those multiple choice questions. There's going to be multiple choice questions on all the lectures and all the associated readings. Okay. Now the essay questions, I hinted at this in the very first video, right, where I talked about the course and expectations and so on. The essay topics, you're going to get a list once you click to start the quiz. You'll see a list. And you can actually bank on not having to write an essay on, say, Hobbes or hedonism. Like, maybe this didn't make a lot of sense to you. You can strategically, right, you can approach the exam knowing that, hey, I don't have to write an essay on at least one topic, right? Because there'll be a slew of other options that you can instead write on. Now, I mentioned this in the first video, right? But you can't avoid, there'll be questions in the multiple choice on all the lectures. Okay, so you can't avoid, you'll have to know, right, the gist of everything we've talked about more or less for the multiple choice. But when it comes to the essays, at least you can, you know, sort of strategize and know that you don't have to, you can sort of ignore one thing. Okay. In terms of, I always get, you know, how long do the essays have to be? There's no good answer to that. Okay, you just, the best advice I can give is answer. You know, everybody's got the same parameters. Okay, you're being, for better or worse, you're being assessed, you know, according to everyone else, right? And you're being sort of measured against the average, if you will, the average essay. I've taught this course, read these sorts of essays for many years, and I have a good sort of grasp of what the average essay looks like. And so your job, right, is to differentiate yourself if you want a really good grade, right, from that average essay. And so there's no, like, you know, it has to be 3 pages or anything like that. There's no rule of thumb there, because you could write 3 pages, but it's all totally irrelevant, right? So no, you know, there's no certain length. I will say, as a rule of thumb, the more relevant detail that you can provide and write that's related to the topic at hand, the better, provided you're not repeating yourself or being redundant, right? So the more relevant detail that you can offer, the better. Right? Let's see here. And look, it's going to be a feeling out process. You know, I could try to describe it so many different ways, but ultimately you're going to have to dive in and eventually take the quiz. And I will say that I do offer some extra points to mitigate for the, you know, the novelty of the exam. You're not as familiar with my expectations and how I'll grade and what philosophy is like. It's a difficult subject as well. So I realize, you know, that this is new to you and so on. And so I do try to ease that process by offering you a few extra points, but you know, you're going to have to just take the quiz and sort of see how it goes, more or less. But if you have any questions, I will say, I'm glad I thought of this. In terms of studying, you know, I do offer those study guides where, you know, I really try to highlight the most essential points or things you should focus on in terms of studying from each of the lectures and the associated readings. So definitely take a look at those study guides. If you know the study guide well and everything covered in the study guide, there's no reason you should not do well on the quiz. I will say again, repeat, do not copy or paraphrase the lecture notes. Do not copy or paraphrase other websites. You will not do well on the quiz. Okay? Doesn't matter if you allude to every point, relevant point, right? If it's clear to me that you're just basically regurgitating everything I said, then while you've alluded to all those points, you haven't actually demonstrated that you understand them, right? You've just demonstrated you can repeat what your instructor said. So you'd be better off only alluding to 2 or 3 of those 10 points, but completely in your own voice and being able to thus demonstrate that you actually understand the points that you're raising rather than just able to raise them. Okay, so I feel like I can caution students about that, you know, 100 times, and yet still I'll have students that basically just repeat the notes and wonder why they're not getting as good of a grade as they could. Well, that's why. Okay, so don't copy or paraphrase the notes. Don't copy or paraphrase other websites. Study, know the study guide, know what's in there. Watch the lectures, read the lecture notes, right? Read the primary material. It's going to be clear if you didn't read the actual text, and you should do well. There's no reason you won't do well. So that's it. If you have any questions while you're studying, obviously chime in the forums or contact me. Otherwise, good luck on the first quiz, and then I'll see you for lecture 7, where we start then the second part of the course, where we turn our attention to utilitarianism and deontology. Thanks.